Sure, we welcome all the comments that we get from our followers and viewers. And one individual a couple of weeks ago said about the war in Ukraine, we're now providing planes. Finding pilots who've got the skills is a bit harder. So he suggested, what about effectively called mercenary pilots, former pilots that maybe can be minimally retrained, available on the open market potentially if they're interested. Why don't we use that as a source of that sort of competence?
Yeah, it was an interesting debate. Thank you, and we're always welcome, as we've always said, comments in, and we'll try and take them up. As a former fighter pilot myself, I think it throws up a whole load of issues. Headline is that the West has said that although President Zelensky reckons he needs well over 100 jets in order to mount a credible combat air capability in Ukraine, the West has so far, I think, promised around 85 F16s, and with a view to potentially having a few more downstream. That sounds pretty close. The problem is, as you said, it's not just about the jets, it's the weapons, it's the engineers, it's everything else. Now, the one thing that you can't do without is the pilot. The pilot takes a long time to train, and although there are training courses going on in the UK as we speak, and they're converting people to the F16s, you can't just put them in an F-16 and send them to war. And the total number of pilots that Ukraine actually has at the moment that are trained to fly the F-16, I understand is very small and potentially could be single digits. They've also, just a couple of weeks ago, tragically, one was shot down. Sounds like friendly fire, sounds like a Patriot system. So they've now got one less. That's a big hit. So, of course, inevitably the question comes out, well, okay, you've got the equipment. Surely you should be able to get pilots from around the world who've flown F-16s, now are airline pilots or whatever, and join. The whole issue of getting Western folk involved, the US has been very clear. They've banned any of their military guys or their reservists, because when you leave the military, that from engaging in the war, because they absolutely, presentationally, are paranoid. It's one thing providing weapons. It's quite another putting combatants on the ground. And therefore, they don't want any risk of that happening. But let's park that for now. Would a pilot who's been out of the cockpit for 5 years...
Or much longer like you.
How quickly would you be able to... Would it take years, or would it be like riding a bike?
But what would it be? I mean, you were a combat air fighter pilot in the most modern plane at the time. What do you reckon? If somebody came to you and you were willing to do it, what would the journey be from now to getting in an F-16 and flying it?
Yeah, well, in a way, you do that when you're in your career, because I stepped out of flying duties. As you get more senior, you spend more and more time sat at a desk and less time in a cockpit.
Is that flying a desk?
Yeah, flying a desk. And I think the longest gap I had was about 5 years. And you go back to the operational conversion unit to relearn how to fly the jet after 5 years away. And when you arrive and the first time you jump in the aircraft, it's instantly familiar, and it's a bit surreal because, for example, when you're flying in the circuit, so you get airborne, fly downwind, and then land, you do that regularly to learn how to land again. Downwind, before you land, there's a whole series of checks you have to do. Your hands are moving around the cockpit. First circuit I did, I watched my hands moving around the cockpit.
Didn't know how it was working.
I didn't know what they were doing, but they knew what they were doing because they were automatically reaching for. And when I was, the Harrier was particularly difficult because you were taking away, there was some aerodynamics, but also some raw power. And how you balance that is a real trick. My hands went straight back into doing it. It was a skill that once you've learnt it, you don't forget. Things like air combat. I thought, have you forgotten everything? No, it's all still there. You're rusty.
So that was in a Harrier, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Right. So, difficult question, but to answer our viewers' contribution, if you can, take yourself now. Okay, you may not be the ideal, not too many grey hairs.
It's hair envy. I've told you about that before.
But take yourself you're going to fly an F-16 in a war in Ukraine. What would you think it would take time-wise, with some of the content to get you?
So if I was the head of the Ukrainian Air Force, I wouldn't be targeting people with anything other than F-16 experience. So the fact that I've flown a military fast jet, I could put a pilot in an F-16, up, down, left, right, faster, slower. That works in virtually any aeroplane.
In a combat situation.
Where the switches are, how you deal, the situational awareness, how you blend mentally, all this stuff going on. Yeah. Going back into a jet that I had been good at, I was just rusty. All the motor skills were still there. It was just a question of getting rid of the rust.
So how long now? So let's say it's a Harrier.
Back to a Harrier, probably 6 months.
6 months. That's a long time.
It is. But if it was wartime, you'd have that, that was 6 months at a fairly relaxed rate.
Okay.
You could probably do it in a matter of 10 to 12 weeks at an intense rate, not allowing, but the core here is you need to have flown the F-16 before, ideally flown the model, the mark of F-16 with a particular set of kit that they're operating, because as soon as the pilot sat in it, he'd get that same sense of deja vu. He'd already know how to do the stuff, and he was on a really intensive. Now, the things he'd be rusty at would be something they'd have to be careful of, but also you would have a whole mass of experience which would still be there that you could capitalize upon. So it wouldn't be a question of just jumping in the jet, unfortunately, but it wouldn't be a couple of years to get them sorted. It would depend on how, I'm not sure the Ukrainians have got a 2-seat F-16, in other words, a trainer. And I'm also not sure whether the Ukrainians have got a comprehensive simulator program available, because the simulators these days are so good that you can do most of your training in that. And where we used to do a simulator every other day, you could actually do 2 or 3 a day and work 7 days a week. You could very quickly get people back up to speed.
So bottom line is, you think it's feasible?
Yes.
Sounds like you'd have to be sort of recently retired from it, to combat the sort of fade and the grey cells, the grey matter sort of deteriorating.
Yeah.
But all of those considered, maybe, in a wartime situation where you can do intensive training, bearing in mind you've got to take a plane up on your own, 3 months.
Yeah, I think that's probably feasible. Again, there's lots of variables in there, but the huge benefit would be that you've got somebody in the cockpit who's used to using some of the technology that the West uses, like Link 16, which effectively helps you build an air picture, which it takes a long time during your training and your early days of experience to work out how you sift through this hose pipe of information to distill out the droplets that you need. But it's interesting, once you've learned to do that, it isn't a skill you easily forget. Whereas for the Ukrainian pilots, they've got to start from scratch with some of that, somebody coming back in. So there's a balance between, yes, a veteran pilot would be rusty, but he starts from a point where he knows how all this stuff works. He knows how to build situational awareness. He knows his own limitations. And things like a 9G aircraft, it's quite brutal on the body, and particularly because it's fly-by-wire in an F-16, so you can literally go 1 to 9G like that. You need to be ready for that, because if you're not ready for it, you're out like a light. And it's quite draining physically. But all of that is a physical training program, mental training program. So I think it's only a matter of months to get people in. And bear in mind, it's not, although the US has said no, the F-16 is the most widely sold fighter jet in the world. There are lots of countries out there that have very capable F-16 pilots who are available in the wings.
John, that's the longest yes answer I've ever heard. But we'll take it. Okay, Sean, so they got the planes. If they can get pilots to match, and they can go from what's been offered 80 odd up to what he wants, 100, does this also open the door to creating a no-fly zone, at least in the west of Ukraine?
The at the start of the war, all right, as a former military pilot, I'm absolutely convinced if the West was to put a no-fly zone over Ukraine, Russia would be stopped in a heartbeat. Russia has struggled to have air superiority over Ukraine when Ukraine has not got the kit or equipment to match it. If you put the West involved, it would stop Russia in a heartbeat. But for all sorts of reasons, that put combatants into the area. NATO's not prepared to do that. So it was taken off the table. First of all, what are you going to use these F-16 pilots for? There's not many of them, and you don't want them to put them too near the front line. So one of the ways of doing it is to help them, get them to shoot down cruise missiles and shoot down drones. Remember when Iran launched that massive wave of attack against Israel back in April, I think it was. The West put up loads of fighter jets and shot down most of these cruise missiles and drones. So undoubtedly, that's one of the ways that Zelensky will be using those F-16s. But now that with Ukraine on the back foot somewhat, it's been raised again that given that Western air power is sitting off the side of Ukraine at the moment as the eyes and the ears over, why doesn't it step over the line and actually only provide a no-fly zone over, for example, the west of Ukraine to help the F-16s and also to help shoot down missiles? Very limited risk of actually killing any Russian pilots, very limited risk of anything going into Russian airspace, not going to get targeted, so it's very unlikely. But you could be quite effective at protecting Ukrainian cities in the western half of Ukraine.
Yeah.
I think there's quite a compelling argument for this, if I'm to be blunt. It does put Western folks into Ukraine, but it does ensure that the normal no-fly zone idea, which was the whole of Ukraine, so you're the Russian on the Russian side of the border, you fire a missile at me, my missile is going to take you out, and therefore I kill you on Russian soil. That is an escalation by the West. If I'm not actually at the front line, if I'm actually hundreds of miles back, but providing a protective shield over parts of Ukraine,
it's different.
It feels different. Now, I know if you go to the binary, it is committing combatants to the war. Politicians aren't prepared to do that. But if you scrap a little bit below the surface, I think it minimizes the risk of actually those combatants being involved against Russia, and all they're doing is helping protect Ukrainians. Be really interesting to see if that's the next thing on the table.